Good afternoon, everybody. We always start on time, you notice that, so we're pretty anal about that whole thing. Thanks for choosing to spend the first breakout session with us. The title of this is Transforming Your Lifestyle, Building Healthy Behaviors, and we put a session together that we wanted to transform beyond weight loss, although that's part of it, but really talk about health in general, and that was kind of the genesis of how we set this up. I'm going to introduce all three of the panel speakers up front, and then they'll just go one after the other. And if we do this correctly, each one will have about 20 minutes max, and about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. The first one, he'll come up in just a moment, that's going to be speaking, is Peter Kaczmarek, who's a professor of Associate Executive Director for Population and Public Health Sciences at the Pennington Biomedical Center here in Baton Rouge. Peter is an internationally recognized leader in the field of physical activity and obesity, with a special emphasis on pediatrics and ethnic health disparities. He has more than 2 decades of experience in conducting large clinical and population-based studies in children and adults. He'll then be followed by Jason Ong, who you all heard this morning. And just to remind you, he is an associate professor in the Department of Neurology. He's a psychologist by training, who's focusing in on sleep hygiene and mindfulness of getting and how to get better sleep quality. And the last one to present will be Dr. Donna Ryan, who's a professor emerita, also at the Pennington Biomedical Center here in Baton Rouge, where she's directed clinical research for 22 years. Donna's continuing research interests include translation of effective weight management into primary care practices. She is the author of more than 200 original publications and 45 books. She's also the associate editor-in-chief for obesity. So if I could also ask Peter to come up first. He's going to talk about time to get up, reducing sedentary behaviors.
All right, hello. Thank you and welcome. Good afternoon, and we're all happy to be here today to talk about sedentary behavior. It's something we can all understand. We're all doing it right now, and it's something that not only humans, but many species, even the fish is sitting down in this picture. So, as we get older, physical activity levels tend to decline, and sedentary behavior actually increases. And this is across species. Dogs, cats, nematodes, you name it. There's a tendency, some biological innateness in which we become more sedentary as we get older. And just to show you an early study here to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about. This was a study done a few years ago. What it shows is the development of obesity and the development of type 2 diabetes among women. And the interesting thing here, these are in women that did not have obesity and they did not have type 2 diabetes at the beginning of the study. And what happened over following them for 6 years, based on the amount of television viewing they had been watching, you could predict this development of obesity and diabetes. So looking here, women who watched more than 40 hours of television a week had twice the risk of developing obesity as someone who only watched 0 to 1 hours a week. And the same with type 2 diabetes. So this just shows that this very popular sedentary behavior, television viewing, is predictive of people who gain weight and develop type 2 diabetes over time. And this was one of the kind of first insights we had about the role of sedentary behavior and health. So with that being said, if you think about our own lives, when we talk about sedentary behavior, we're talking about sitting. Okay, it's pretty much synonymous. You can't be sedentary unless you're sitting. If you're standing, that doesn't really count. So looking at this kind of slide, you'll see we have to think carefully about what sedentary behavior is. Because if we were just to ask you, how many hours a day do you spend sitting, people might say about 6 hours, something like that, on average. However, if you were to ask people, how much time do you spend sitting in the car? How much time do you spend watching television? How much time do you spend eating while you're sitting? And you add all of that up, it's more like 11 hours a day people spend sedentary. So in the United States, we spend an awful lot of time sedentary, and actually around the world. But we are one of the leaders when it comes to sedentary behavior. Even Sitting Bull here, he's sitting, so we have to give him a lesson, I think. So, what are the implications of all this sitting? This was a study we did back in 2009 at the Pennington Biomedical Center over in Baton Rouge. And this is one of those epidemiological studies where you measure something in people, a baseline, and then you follow them over time and look for mortality. So, in other words, how many people were dying? It's kind of a morbid profession, but that's how it's a hard outcome. It's like taxes. Everyone has to pay taxes. Well, at least most people. But death is either a 0 or a 1. You're either dead or alive. And so it's a very hard outcome, and epidemiologists like to use it as kind of the ultimate health outcome. And so what we did, we arranged these people based on the amount of time they spend sitting in a day. So the top line are people who said they spend almost none of the time sitting, quarter of the time, half, 3/4, or almost all the time in that bottom line. So this is their self-reported level of sitting throughout the day. And what this graph shows is cumulative survival. In other words, over 12 years of follow-up on the bottom, we follow these people for 12 years, and this was essentially who was dead or alive at the end of the study. And so if you follow that top line, at the end of the study, 95% of those people were still alive 12 years later. That said, they sit almost none of the time. If you go to that bottom line, it's something like 80%. So people who sit almost all the time, only 80% of that group is alive. So you have to ask yourself, what group would you want to be in? Would you want to be in a group of people where 12 years from now, 95% of you are still alive? Or would you want to be in a group of people where 80% of you were still alive? That's a big difference over 12 years. So this was one of the first studies that showed what we call this dose-response relationship. It's very clear. The more time you spend sitting, the greater your risk of mortality is. So this is pretty solid evidence from an epidemiological perspective. The more time we spend sitting, the increased health risks we have. And just to turn the data around a little bit to show you how these people died. Well, these people were dying just like normal Americans or Canadians, dying of cardiovascular disease as a primary cause of death, and also dying of cancer and other causes. So what this shows is essentially your risk. So looking at all cause, this is dying of anything. You could have had a heart attack, you could have died of cancer, you could have been shot by a jealous husband, or gotten hit by a bus. Whatever it is, it's just anyone who died. We don't know how they died. But nevertheless, that group that sits most of the day was 1.5 times more likely to die compared to someone who's sitting less. So they had about a 50% increased risk of death. That's pretty powerful. If you look at the CVD, that means cardiovascular disease, and it's a very similar relationship. These people are dying of heart disease, strokes. You'll notice something about cancer is relatively flat. And many studies have replicated our work now, and they show a similar thing. The sitting doesn't necessarily impact cancer to the same degree as cardiovascular disease and other metabolic disorders. And finally, other causes of death, this could be anything else other than cancer or CVD. So we see this very strong pattern for metabolic disease and cardiovascular disease death based on the amount of time we spend sitting. And I want to just kind of wrap up this section with showing you this. This shows the relationship in different categories of BMI. So on the left, we have normal weight, less than 25 BMI. Then people with overweight are in the middle group, and people with obesity are on the far right. And we do see a similar association in all groups, but if you look at the height of the bars, that tells you your risk of dying. And it's the group that are living with obesity and also sitting the most. They have the highest probability of death of anyone in this group. And if you look at it, it is substantially higher. And here is overweight, and here is normal weight. So not only, is there associated risks with sitting, the risks are compounded as people gain weight. So a takeaway from this is that if you're, gaining weight and becoming overweight, it's even more important that you reduce the amount of time you spend sitting. So getting up and moving around is even more important as people gain weight. So that's a message I think that shouldn't really be lost here. So I think all of us have seen this. The media has really picked up on this sitting disease. Sitting is the new smoking. Sitting is going to kill us all. And so there's a great call for guidelines around sitting. How much sitting should we really do? And it's very, very difficult to give you an answer to that question because, as I showed you, there's a dose-response relationship. The more sitting you do, the greater your risk. And there's no threshold. We can't say it's 6 hours or 8 hours. There's no threshold effect. So it's kind of like exposure to the sun and using sunscreen. We don't tell you exactly how much you should avoid. We just say, put on sunscreen and avoid exposure to the sun. It's a similar message with sitting. We just avoid sitting. If you're doing 10 hours a day, try to do less. If you're doing 6 hours a day, try to do less. Because the more you do, the greater the risk is. So I'll just give you a few tips here that you may have thought about and you may not have. This is a very fast-moving field. And I wanted to give you just some tips on how to reduce the amount of time you spend sitting. Because it's hard to tell someone just not to sit as much. There's got to be something that we tell them to do. The obvious thing is to stand up and move more. But again, we also understand that standing all day isn't healthy for us either. People who have standing occupations have problems with the musculoskeletal system, with the circulation in their lower limbs. So there's got to be something we can do if we're going to promote people to stand up and not sit so much. So think about your commute. Most of us are driving cars long distance in traffic, and this is causing a lot of problems for our health. So we have good evidence, obviously, that commuting through either walking or cycling, and even taking public transportation, can reduce your risk of metabolic disease. Even taking the bus, you wouldn't think that's a big deal. But you have to get up and you have to go to the bus stop. Many people stand while they're on public transportation, and they're not just sitting in a car for their commute. So, these are options for many people where they have the ability to do this. The other thing at work, there's been a big focus on reducing sedentary behavior in the workplace. Because we're all chained to a desk, and we're sitting all day working in a computer. But there are ways to break up that sitting. You may have heard about these new treadmill desks that are out there where people can walk while they're at work, or standing desks. These work fairly well if you can maintain, people using them. And they can be expensive. So some companies, just to give you an idea, they may not buy everybody a standing desk or a treadmill desk, but they may buy 5 or 6 of them and put them in an area where you could sign them out for an hour during the day. So if you had a teleconference you had to do or something like that, you sign up one of the desks and you can go work there. So it's using these kind of innovative solutions we can get around the extensive cost of some of these things. Other things we do, you'll see these pictures here, we could have a standing meeting or a walking meeting. Rather than having someone come in and sit around a table, you could go take a walk outside or walk the halls of your business. Another thing which I like to do actually is standing on conference calls. In my profession, I have a lot of conference calls that last 1 or 2 hours, and I try to walk around during those conference calls. At least it gets you off the chair. Thinking about at home, there are ways to be active at home and to reduce sitting. I had to put in Tony Danza here for Donna. You remember Who's the Boss when he was vacuuming and he's lifting the couch with one arm? All the ladies love that. We can be active. We can stand in the kitchen. Another thing a lot of people do is they'll put a stationary bicycle in front of the television. So at least, when they're watching NCIS New Orleans, that they can actually be active. They can be pedaling away and watching the TV. And I don't know what that woman's doing on the right, but it looked pretty impressive to me. So just a couple of other things to think about. As my wife and I went to dinner last night and she was wearing her high heels, footwear is very important. Just invest in a good pair of walking shoes. Not only are they good for walking, they're good for standing and for light activity. Right now, the physical activity guidelines for Americans, they focus on moderate to vigorous physical activity, getting out and getting active for 150 minutes per week. Now, we're learning more, though, in the intervening years since 2008 when those guidelines came out. We're learning a lot more that light activities, just moving around, something that wouldn't be what you call moderate, we're not talking about jogging or brisk walking, just more light activities also have an impact on our health. And it may be more related to the total accumulation throughout the day, which is why I put a picture of this step counter. If you can accumulate more steps throughout the day, you lower your risk of metabolic disease and you lower your risk of mortality, irrespective of how moderate or how vigorous it is. So just investing in something like a good pair of walking shoes and a pedometer where you can track your progress and accumulate even light activity throughout the day, we will see improvements in health. And I think that is the takeaway that I have for you today. And of course, this guy gets a lot of moderate to vigorous activity around Pennington, and I'll leave you with that. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to go from sedentary activities to sedating activities here. So I'm going to be talking to you about sleeping tight and don't let those stress bugs bite. So my talk is going to be basically in two parts. The first part, we're going to talk about sleep. So we're going to talk about more details from what I mentioned this morning about what you can do to optimize your sleep health. And then the second part is going to be about stress. And I'm going to talk about this really more in the context of sleep and stress. So a few pointers here in terms of different things you can do for stress management as it might relate to optimizing your sleep health. So I showed this earlier this morning, but just in case there are some people here who may not have made that talk, this is what the National Sleep Foundation published here in terms of different recommendations for sleep. So the idea here is that that dark blue band over there in the middle is the recommended duration of sleep across the age range. So you can see that for babies, for children, they should be sleeping at least half the day or more. As people hit puberty and into adulthood, it kind of stabilizes mostly around 7 to 9 hours. So for most adults, it's somewhere in that 7 to 9 hour range is what we need for optimal sleep health. Outside of that dark blue range, you have that light blue range, which is where there is some evidence that you sleep in this area could be detrimental to your health, but the findings aren't necessarily consistent. There may be other people who can sleep in that range and they can still do okay. So that's saying it may be appropriate. And then really outside of that range is the stuff in the orange, light orange. That's really what they don't recommend. That's when there is going to be a lot of evidence that it's detrimental to your health. So this gives you an idea of what the recommendations are for sleep duration. So sleep duration and the amount of sleep is one thing, but what about sleep health? There's a nice paper here by Dr. Dan Bicey, who's at the University of Pittsburgh, and he really asked this question about, well, can we define sleep health? Does it really matter? And he proposed a few different aspects of sleep health in terms of what it is. So first of all, it's multidimensional. Right? It isn't just the amount of sleep, so we've talked about that this morning. It also should involve the quality of sleep, so that might involve the different sleep stages, how well refreshed you feel upon awakening. It's also the timing of sleep. So I mentioned circadian rhythms and biological clocks earlier this morning. The timing of when your sleep phase is relative to your own clock, if it's better aligned, that also might give you a better chance for sleep health. It should also be adapted to individuals, to social, environmental demands. So here the idea is norms and cultures, because in some cultures, for example, they take a nap in the middle of the day, and that actually seems to be totally acceptable and doesn't seem to be detrimental to their health. Other societies don't have that, so we should factor in some cultural aspects here as well. It's not just a one-size-fits-all across all cultures and all people. And also, it should matter. Right, so however much sleep you get, and in terms of what your sleep health is, ideally sleep health should be associated with optimal physical and mental well-being, right? So it should matter. And if you didn't have good sleep health, it should also be related to having issues with physical and mental health. And then finally, the idea is that, and we're kind of guilty of this in sleep medicine, we talk a lot about sleep disturbance and when sleep is insufficient. We forget to talk about the opposite of it, which is the positive aspects of sleep. So the idea here is sleep health isn't just the absence of disturbed sleep, that you can actually have positive and optimal health when it comes to sleep. So what are the characteristics of optimal sleep health? Again, if you came to my talk earlier, you heard me introduce this acronym SATED. Just to go over it with you here, so the idea is that the S stands for satisfied. This is feeling refreshed when you wake up, just a sense that you got good quality and good satisfactory sleep. It feels good. The A is alertness, so when you are awake, you should not have to put a lot of effort into staying awake. So this term of effortless wakefulness is kind of a nice one to think about, because if you have to have a lot of coffee or constantly be moving around to keep awake, then that might be an indication you're not achieving optimal sleep health. The timing, so again, the relationship of when your sleep is occurring relative to your biological clock ideally should be aligned. Efficiency, so you should be able to fall asleep and stay asleep throughout most of the night. If you start to have more than 30 minutes of time where you're awake, that starts to get into our criteria for diagnosing somebody with insomnia. And then the duration of your sleep. So it should be a sufficient amount of sleep, and we just talked about what's normal across the age range. So let's go into some of these how-tos. Okay, how can you optimize your sleep? So the first one is set aside a regular window for sleep. And I use this term intentionally. I like for people to think about this as a window of opportunity for sleep. So you have to set this aside. So let me kind of walk you through this. The idea is that, for example, this person is setting aside a window from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Okay, and so this is the time that they are setting aside for sleep. The thing is, you can't make sleep happen. So the analogy I make is, it's like if you're gardening, okay, and you're trying to grow some vegetables here. So you can't make vegetables grow, right? But what you can do is you can make sure you pick out the right seeds. You make sure that you have the right, right container, the right soil. Make sure you're watering it the right amount, maybe the right sunlight. You can regulate the different parameters. But then you have to have patience that this vegetable is going to grow, right? So sleep is kind of like that. You can't directly make sleep happen, but you can regulate and manage some of the parameters around that to give it the best chance to grow. So the idea is if you set aside this window of opportunity, you're trying to grow sleep within that window. But it's not going to happen unless you set this aside and you manage and regulate some things, all right? So the second thing here is if you have a bad night, try not to compensate. Okay, try not to make up for it, at least not at one time. And so here we get into this idea of sleep debt. All right, a lot of people have heard of this idea of sleep debt. And what I'll say here is that short-term sleep debt is actually okay. And actually, the way that sleep works, so I talked about the circadian rhythms, but there's actually sort of the sleep deficit that accumulates across wakefulness. So on any given day, the amount of time that you're awake actually builds this quote-unquote appetite for sleep that actually helps you sleep at night. And if you didn't sleep well one night, you're going to have a higher sleep appetite that will actually help you sleep better the next day if you don't try to compensate too much. So in the short term, for the day or two, you can manage some sleep debt. You can see, though, as it increases, if you continue to build up debt, just like financial debt, eventually it'll catch up to you. So the idea is long-term sleep debt is bad, but in the short term, it's okay. And what tends to happen, this is very common for people with insomnia, is when they start to constantly try to make up for sleep, what happens here is that, up here you see the top line is that pre-morbid good sleep. This is that sleep window I showed you for the person who's sleeping well. If you start developing insomnia, so for this person it looks like they were having trouble, they were waking up too early. And then you get this behavioral adaptation. So this person's trying to go to bed earlier. It looks like around 10 o'clock now, maybe even 9:30, and they're staying in bed later. if you keep doing this over and over, now what's happening is that basically your brain thinks, oh, well, if I've got 10 hours of sleep and I only need about 8 hours, well, you can be awake for 2 hours during that time. So inadvertently, what people with insomnia don't realize is by compensating for this and spending more time in bed, you inadvertently actually condition yourself to actually be awake in bed. Okay, this is actually a common problem. So one of the things we do with people with insomnia is try to get back to that original sleep window. Okay, so the third thing here is avoid waking activities in bed. And here I would say the most common enemy here is our electronics and our screen time. And I alluded to this earlier, but there are studies now that show that children who use more electronic devices in the bedroom do sleep a lot less compared to their peers. And this is a real problem, I think, especially with this generation that grew up with iPhones and iPads, tablets, and so forth. Because, not only are you engaged in things, but you also have the light from the screen that can impact your circadian rhythms. So this is a real problem, and this is where I think we need to be careful about technology. And, technology is really good for a lot of things, but in some ways it can actually work against us, and it can actually work against some of our natural ways of regulating sleep if we're not careful. So leave the screens, ideally outside of the bedroom altogether, but definitely outside of the bed. And this will give you a better chance to be sleepy. Okay, so the fourth thing here is be careful about the impact of substances. So caffeine is probably the one that people are most familiar with. The idea here is it's okay to drink caffeine, but be careful in terms of the amount you're drinking. So ideally, you're not drinking more than 3 cups. But this is just a good rule of thumb. And also, you're not drinking it too late in the day. So generally speaking, it's better to stop drinking caffeine about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon for most people who go to bed at about 10 or 11 o'clock, because it takes like about 6 hours or so for caffeine to get processed in your system. Alcohol. So alcohol is kind of interesting because it actually is categorized as sort of a downer or a depressant, so it actually can help you fall asleep. But the thing is, it actually disrupts the sleep stages. It suppresses your REM sleep. It also suppresses your slow wave sleep a little bit. Those are 2 of the most important stages of sleep. And the other thing it does is it actually makes breathing more challenging. It suppresses breathing. So for people who might have sleep apnea, it can actually make that worse. Even for people who don't, it might make you more prone to snoring. Okay, so alcohol is kind of a double whammy. Now, I tell my patients I'm not here to be a prohibitionist, right? And I enjoy wine as well. And so I tell people, look, you can still have your alcohol, but just have it earlier in the night. So from a sleep standpoint, it's better to avoid drinking about 2 hours before bedtime. Good rule of thumb here is like what they teach you in terms of drinking and driving, that you can generally process about 1 drink per hour. So we say 2 hours just to be safe, gives you a little bit more time for that to be processed, and there it's less likely to impact your nighttime sleep. So you can still have your fun with your alcohol. And then nicotine. So nicotine also can be disturbing to sleep. I'm always surprised at people who tell me that when they wake up in the middle of the night and can't sleep, that smokers will go out and smoke. And, that really can trigger your system to kind of make it more alert. So it's best to avoid using alcohol during your window of sleep. And I usually tell people it's a similar rule of thumb. I would say, if you can, try to avoid it within 2 hours of your bedtime as well, just to be safe. Okay, so the 5th rule here is be as active as you can during the daytime. So, really, a lot of what happens at night can also depend on how you're doing during the day. And so being as active as you can during the day actually helps to regulate your circadian rhythms. It can actually help make your appetite for sleep a little more potent. So I mentioned that earlier. It actually, can generate that sensation of sleepiness. So those are the type of things that can actually help you at night. And I think one thing we don't talk about enough in the sleep world is the focus on what happens during the daytime. So it's not just focusing on the nighttime part in terms of what's important for your sleep health, but it's also how you spend your waking hours during the daytime. So when should you seek professional help? So if you find that people are complaining about your snoring, if you have partners that are observing pauses in your breathing, or they think you stop breathing during your sleep, and especially if you have daytime sleepiness as well, these might be indications of obstructive sleep apnea. So this is where you would need an overnight sleep evaluation. Sometimes you can do this at home or in a sleep lab. That's when you should go seek help. If your issues are constant sleepiness and spending more time in bed and trying to sleep more doesn't really seem to help, it could mean that you have narcolepsy or a hypersomnia disorder. These are people whose brains are basically generating too much sleepiness. And also, if you're sleeping at odd times, your biological clock seems to be different, it seems to be offset, or you don't really even seem to be having a biological clock or a regular time for sleep, you may be at risk for having a circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorder. And finally, if you can't sleep when you want to, you're losing confidence in your ability to sleep, come find me. Okay, that's your indications of insomnia. That's most of what I do in terms of my behavioral treatments. Okay, so let me segue a little bit to stress and talking about stress. And I want to focus on the stress response. So most of you have probably heard of the fight or flight system. And this is basically the system that's designed in our body to be able to respond to stress. And back when we were cavemen and cavewomen, the idea is that this helped us respond to predators, to immediate threats in the environment. We might get a surge of adrenaline, and this was important for survival, right? This is what made us either like fight the enemy or fight the predator, or we run away from it. And so the fight or flight response usually involves things like shallow breathing, rapid heart rate, sweating. So these are probably familiar with us on an acute basis. Now, what tends to happen in modern society is that we don't have these predators, but we have things like annoying bosses. We may have deadlines. And so what happens is things are elevated at a lower level. It might be like a low to moderate level that can trigger this fight or flight system. And what might happen here is it's kind of like one of these car alarms from the 90s. You probably remember like sort of the tone. I was going to play it for you here, but I think it's annoying enough to where you guys know what it is. But the idea is that, sometimes in those old car alarm systems, it's set such that, like, if it starts to rain, it goes off, or some car drives by with loud bass, it sets it off. And, so these are sort of the false alarms. And sometimes what can happen is with the fight or flight system, we get a false alarm, and, suddenly the fight or flight system gets triggered. And when the fight or flight system gets triggered, it will override your sleep systems. So even if your circadian rhythm is telling you should be sleeping, even if you have this high drive or appetite for sleep, your fight or flight system says, look, it's more important to be awake than to be asleep right now. We need to be awake, and it's going to override that. So if this happens all the time, then you might end up kind of like this minion over here. Okay, so, I bet a lot of you have had this experience where, you think you're sleepy, you think you're ready for bed, you get into bed, and boom, you're wide awake, right? So this might be an indication that your fight or flight system is a little bit hyperactivated. So what are some ways that we can manage stress and try to reduce that fight or flight system at night? The first thing is to establish boundaries. And I talked about that sleep window. You should respect your sleep window, but also you should try to stop some of the work-related activities at least an hour before bedtime. And sometimes I'll tell people, set an alarm. Now, it sounds weird. Why would you set an alarm at night? We're used to setting alarms to wake up in the morning. But sometimes it's helpful to have different things where we're reminding ourselves that, hey, we need to actually stop that activity. So for some people, especially people who tend to be night owls or do work at night, it can be helpful to actually set alarms at night to remind yourself that we need to stop, we need to unplug, we need to give ourselves a fair chance to kind of let ourselves decompress and to have allow for that sleep window to take place. Okay. Second thing here is setting aside an outlet time for thoughts and worries. So for people who are chronic worriers, people who might have racing minds, sometimes this can impact sleep. There's something that I call a structured worry time. And the structured worry time is kind of interesting. So the idea here is that you set aside a regular time each day. It can be anywhere from about 15 to 30 minutes. Starting off, it might be 10 or 15 minutes. And what you do here is you just spend that time worrying. Okay. Now, it's important that you do this regularly, so you should put this in your calendar. But yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive. Like, why would you spend time worrying? Well, the idea is that if you get it off your chest, it's less likely to come out at other times. And part of the reason why these worries and thoughts tend to come out at night is because that's when you don't have other activities to distract you. Okay, and so it's more likely to come out. But if you give yourself an opportunity to have this come out, it's a little bit more likely to come out at that time and less likely to come out when you don't want it to come out in the middle of the night. So I tell people, write things down. If it's a matter of things that you need to do, write your list. Sometimes it's not necessarily problem-solving type of things, but it's some things that are on your mind that are stress-related, emotional. If that's the case, you might consider journaling. And there is actually research evidence behind this idea of getting something off your chest. So what they call expressive writing or disclosure writing actually can be very helpful as an emotion regulation strategy. So get it off your chest, spend your time writing it down. Now, inevitably, what will happen is that you will have some worries or some thoughts come out at times outside of your structured worry time. And if that happens, just make a note to yourself and say, okay, here's something I need to do in my next worry time. Okay, just like if you are, have a meeting scheduled to deal with something, you don't want to spend a lot of other time dealing with it. You make a note and said, okay, I need to put this on my agenda for the next meeting. Okay, so it's kind of what you're doing here is a meeting to yourself. In the context of sleep, it's usually helpful to complete your worry time at least 1 hour before bedtime. And the reason is because if you're worrying and you're letting this stuff out, you're probably going to get anxious, right? So it should be expected that you get more anxious during the structured worry time, and that's okay. And because of that, you want to give yourself a little bit of time to decompress. So I tell people, do some relaxing, soothing activities after your structured worry time, and give yourself about an hour or so, sometimes a little bit more, to be able to relax, have that fight or flight system come down, and that'll give you a better chance to sleep during your sleep window. Okay, and then the last thing is actually a pretty simple thing, pretty straightforward, but it's be assertive and learn to say no. And this can be tough, and this is something I still work on, but we do need to be assertive. Being assertive is different than being aggressive. Being assertive is just saying, look, I need my boundaries, and you explain to people, here's what I need, and sometimes you just have to say no, okay? So that is an important stress management. When should you contact a mental health provider? Well, if stress is starting to impact other areas of your life, like your relationship, work, family, etc., that might be an indication you need to seek professional help. If you're starting to have panic attacks, uncontrollable worries, it's getting out of your control, that's also another time to go and seek help. And if you're feeling depressed for at least 2 weeks in a row and you can't pull yourself out, or if you start to have thoughts of hurting yourself, then this is an indication that you might be in a more serious level of depression. It's important to contact a mental health provider at that point. So I showed you this earlier. This is the yin and the yang, and I really do believe that a lot of this in terms of sleeping tight and also with stress management is about balance and regulation. So keep this in mind when you are trying to improve your sleep health and also manage stress. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason, and I want to thank all of you for coming to my hometown. Yay. Yeah, now I got you here. I got you where I want you. Okay, so and thank you, Bob, for giving me this topic, Tools in the Toolbox, Resources to Keep Yourself Accountable. So these are my disclosures. I have a number of relationships with industry, but none of them are really in the self-monitoring device or app area. So this is not truly my area of expertise, but I'm fortunate in that I get to work at the Pennington Center, and we have some incredible behavioral psychologists there who know all about these self-monitoring devices and about creating apps. And they've taught me a lot about it, which I intend to share with you over the next 20 minutes or so. So, here we go. This is my plan, what I want to do with this 20 minutes. Let me start out with giving you sort of a big picture of what we're trying to do to achieve weight loss and then to sustain that hard-won weight loss. And then I want to put that into the context of the real world and all of the pitfalls and barriers that make weight loss maintenance so difficult. Then we'll move on and talk a bit about wearable devices and how we use them and what these tools are all about, and then finally get into some of the apps that I think work best if they're married to some of the self-monitoring devices. So here we go. What are the current strategies to sustain successful weight loss? Well, this is the construct. We believe that weight loss requires a different approach from maintenance of that lost weight. So for weight loss, it's all about creating an energy deficit. For weight loss maintenance, it's all about calorie balance. It's a calorie neutral condition. So the most efficient way to achieve weight loss is to produce this energy deficit with diet. And the reason that's most efficient is to create that energy deficit with physical activity takes a lot of time. Yeah, it's true, you can do it. You can create a large energy deficit with physical activity. but it's in boot camp types of situations. For us, for free living individuals, we have jobs, we have responsibilities at home, we have children, we have parents, we have clubs that we belong to, we have social activities. So to carve out enough time to really be able to create a large energy deficit through physical activity, it's just not something that is feasible for most of us. What we're generally trying to produce in an energy deficit is about a 25% caloric reduction, and it's easiest to do this by restricting food intake. So for weight loss, we believe that the diet is more important. Of course, we're promoting physical activity during the weight loss phase because we want to ingrain those physical activity behaviors. When we get out to weight loss maintenance, we believe that the most important thing is to focus on physical activity. And the reason we believe this is because we really want a calorie balance to support that weight loss maintenance. And we know that the adaptation that occurs with weight loss, the metabolic adaptation, has a big component that we think can be partially overcome by increasing physical activity. So once you lose weight, your metabolic rate declines disproportionately. And the metabolic rate is not just resting metabolic rate. Muscle efficiency increases, and there is less activity thermogenesis that's going on. So if we can increase purposeful activity, we can overcome some of the metabolic adaptations that's occurred after weight loss, and we believe that's why physical activity is so important in weight loss maintenance. So we know there's several factors that work in supporting the maintenance of that weight loss, and first and foremost is physical activity. In the National Weight Loss Registry, for women, the average caloric expenditure per week in purposeful physical activity is 2,400 calories a week. So when I get on the treadmill, it takes me over an hour to get up to 400 calories. And that's moderate physical activity. I'm sweating to do that. And so that means 6 days a week of that. So it's still a lot of physical activity that's required to really support that long-term weight loss maintenance. But we also know there are other factors that are important from that National Weight Loss Registry. One factor is having some regularity to meals, and especially eating breakfast. So it's avoiding those energy-dense, high-calorie foods that are triggers to reward eating, and it's increasing fruit and vegetable consumption and fiber consumption, but it's also maintaining that regularity of meals. And we also know from other studies that if we can replace at least one meal a day with a portion-controlled entree or liquid drink or something like that, a meal replacement, will do much better at long-term weight loss maintenance than if we're just eating 3 free-living meals a day in the face of life's wonderful buffet. The other thing that we know that works is continuing medications. Now, my patients are taking medications because they work through biology to help them better adhere to their dietary plans. And I know from study after study, these medications, they work to increase the amount of weight loss, but to me, the biggest value of these medications is that as long as patients will continue to take them, the weight loss will be maintained. To me, that's an enormous value of this. I know that when my patients stop their medications, we see this slow, steady weight regain. So continuing medications is another factor that's important in successful weight loss maintenance. But in a broader context, other things are important too in supporting weight loss maintenance. And these are all of the pitfalls that can occur across the lifespan. So we know that good sleep hygiene is very important because having poor sleep hygiene can derail your adherence to the behaviors that support long-term weight loss maintenance. And I know my patients with type 2 diabetes absolutely must avoid hypoglycemia because they'll eat to defend against hypoglycemia. And even a little bit of hypoglycemia, even mild hypoglycemia, really increases their sensitivity to this reward eating. So depression and mental health are very important to manage, and managing the medications that we use for many of those mental health problems. It's also important because many of those drugs can promote weight gain. There are other drugs that we've got to be careful about, and those include some of the medications we're using for type 2 diabetes that drive weight gain, and also some contraceptive approaches that can drive weight gain. Stress management, extremely important, because this is another thing that can drive that susceptibility to reward eating and derail weight loss maintenance. And I think one thing we really overlook is the role of financial management skills in preventing that stressful situation that derails our weight loss maintenance. We did a study at Pennington where we randomized people to a control condition or to a weight loss intervention. It was in a community setting. The control condition was we taught financial management skills, and both groups lost weight, the same amount of weight. So I think that financial stress is something that we don't talk about very much, but which is very, very important. And last, I think we need to acknowledge the role of our environment and the role that environment plays on derailing our weight loss maintenance efforts. So we need to seek better built environments, better work environments, and better food environments to help support our weight loss maintenance strategies. And we need to advocate for better built environments, work environments, and food environments for the community at large. So let's move on to these wearables. I know everybody is interested in wearables. They're a remarkable phenomenon in the U.S. marketplace, and this is just an example of some of them. So, do these wearables actually produce weight loss? If you were here yesterday, you heard me ask this question of Dr. Church, and his answer is correct. No, they don't produce weight loss by themselves. They're tools. They're tools that we use for monitoring, and if we're measuring a behavior, we're more aware of it, and we're more likely to be changing that behavior. So here's an example of the evidence base that supports these wearables not having any magical effect in producing weight loss. This is a study that John Jakisik did on 471 participants. And he took those participants and he put them in a 6-month weight loss intervention. At the end of 6 months, he randomized them to the maintenance phase. And the standard therapy for the maintenance phase was access to a website. And the website had places on it for patients to self-monitor their food intake, physical activity. It had all of the educational resources available on that website. The participants also got access to telephone counseling and also to text prompts to help them sustain that weight loss. And then one group got that standard intervention. And then one group got the standard intervention, and they were given one of those cool monitoring devices to wear to measure physical activity. And I'm not going to slam the company that so generously donated these devices. But the bottom line is, at the end of 2 years, the group wearing the devices with access to the website had lost only 3.5 kilograms. I can see this is not my latest slide set. Bob? Okay, so that's 7 pounds. And the group that wasn't wearing the device lost 13 pounds. So greater weight loss in the group that wasn't wearing the device. Why is that? Well, the study wasn't designed to measure that, but there was no difference in groups in terms of body composition, fitness levels, physical activity levels, and dietary intake. So what the point of this is that there's nothing magic about that wearable monitor. It's just a cool tool to assist in monitoring physical activity. So we know that that self-monitoring is incredibly important because it gives feedback on your behavior and other outcomes. But feedback is only part of the equation. The prompting part of this is also important. We know that both prompting and feedback are key variables, and the feedback, particularly if it's tailored to you and your needs, it can be a key component of success. But I want to give you a warning, and that is too much prompting may not be a good thing, because we've all had our devices talking to us and prompting to us, and after a while, it's a point of diminishing returns. We just turn the machine off because we're tired of getting annoyed by it. So prompting is good, but it has to be tailored prompting, and it has to be the right amount of prompting. So we want to marry our app with the monitoring device. And we know that monitoring is a key element of cognitive behavior therapy. If you're measuring it, it's possible for it to change. And also tracking of a behavior allows you to become aware of that behavior and the circumstances that precipitate or surround that behavior. So if we can give tailored feedback, that can mimic the counseling we're doing in a face-to-face setting. And if we can provide online social support, that can mimic the social support we're giving in our face-to-face interventions. So if we really want to have an impact on a culture, we need to understand that culture and use it and use what the culture is doing. This shows you the average time spent per adult user per day with digital media in the United States from 2008 to 2015. And as you can see in green, this is the mobile, time spent on mobile digital media. And that has been growing steadily. I mean, it's incredible. The amount of time spent on desktop, laptop, and other devices has been relatively stable across that period. The real growth has been on those mobile technologies. It's our smartphones. This is not news to anybody in the room, I'm certain. But what was news to me, and I was shocked by this, is the total amount of time the average American is spending on digital media per day. It's 5.6 hours. That's incredible. So it's a challenge and it's an opportunity. So the opportunity is, can we use this cultural trend to help get to patients and help patients achieve better long-standing weight loss? So what we want to do with our app, what we want in the ideal app is to be able to track weight, track BMI, track physical activity, track sleep, calculate and track body fat over time. We want our app to be able to give us a caloric prescription based on data that we prescribe, and we want to be able to track our food and nutrient intake over time. We want to have a searchable database of foods, and also a database that we can go in and modify for the foods we're eating most often to make it easier for us to track our food intake. We'd like it to be user-friendly and easy to add or remove foods, access reports, and so forth. We want to be able to set goals with these apps. We want the app to be able to not just give us a calorie recommendation. We want it to be able to give us a meal plan, give us some recipes, generate grocery lists for us. We'd like and we'd like to be able to summarize reports from these apps that we can use over the long term. So that's our desirable features. But that's not enough. We want more. We'd like some plug-ins. Why not have our app interface with a digital scale? Why not use barcode scanning to make knowing what's in the content of our foods even easier? We'd like it to interface with the activity monitor, of course, and if we got a sleep monitor, let's have it interface with that. And there's even an emerging technology that uses food photography to help us figure out what the caloric content and nutrient content of food is and portion sizes. And by all means, let's have it be inexpensive, or better yet, free. Yeah, we want yay! We want this to give us access to social support. So we want to be able to buddy up with other people on our app so we can have a friend on the weight management journey. And we will also like some sort of community aspects, not just one buddy, but many others. And we want to be able to access true professionals. We want experts to help us with questions that we have on our journey. So, the number one wearable in the United States is the Fitbit. Everybody's heard of them. It allows you to track your steps, the distance, the calories burned, the floors climbed, the active minutes. It gives you reminders to get up and move about every hour, and it also tracks sleep. It's connected to a web platform and to a phone app to do that. The other number one fitness app in the world is MyFitnessPal, and it has many of these features that are desirable. However, my two complaints with MyFitnessPal are, first of all, it hasn't really used the expertise of dietitians and the behavioral interventionists that we have out there. So if you have a question on MyFitnessPal, you don't really get to go to an expert in weight loss. And to me, that's a problem, because we've got a body of research to support how to best achieve and sustain weight loss, and I want to see MyFitnessPal putting that in there. My other complaint with it is that there's no real safety parameters with regard to the calorie goal. They let you set any kind of calorie goal whatsoever, and that's not always safe. So I would like to see that added to MyFitnessPal, and I'd like to see it have a better meal planner associated with it. So there are plenty of other apps out there, and here's a list of the most popular one. Some of our dietitians like to look up calories on Calorie King. We've got Spark People is a favorite of some people, eDiets. I want to give a plug to Weight Watchers on here. Weight Watchers has consistently generated an evidence base to support its safety and efficacy. And to me, it should be one of the go-to apps on this list. Another one that's very good was developed at Pennington. That's that HELTH, Healthy Eating, Active Living, and I forget what the TH stands for. But that was developed for the military and military families. It has sort of a camouflage skin on it, but it has all of the positive attributes that I believe are needed in a successful app. So check that one out. Look that one up. I want to finish here with two of my personal favorites. And they're probably not ones that you've ever heard of, but I want you to go and look up Kevin Hall's Body Weight Planner. You can Google this. This was developed by the NIH and the USDA. One of the problems that I have with my patients is that they want to lose a lot of weight very fast. And the good thing about this app, it's on the web, is that it allows you to have a realistic expectation about how weight loss occurs. Very important. You can go on there. There's a video that you can click on. It shows you how to use it, and everybody should go on there and play around with it. And my other number two, but has a special place in my heart, is Calm. So I listen to Calm every night. It's a free app. You can kind of upgrade it for a little bit of money if you want to, but you don't have to. It does guided meditation, no talk meditation. But what I use it for are the sleep stories. Now, if everyone had this app, we wouldn't be having a talk here by Dr. Ong. Because what this app does is it tells you a sleep story read by a person with a very soothing voice. I have not made it to the end of any one of these sleep stories. And if you are having trouble falling asleep, this is the app for you. Okay, so this is my main message to you. What we're trying to do here in weight loss maintenance is develop accountability. And that accountability is what's being promoted by these wearables and apps. So if you want to be accountable, first you got to measure it. Then you got to track it. You need to get a prompt when you're falling out of range of what your goals are. You need to go out and find some social support and find the experts and avoid all the pitfalls that I told you about. So thank you very much, and especially thank you for coming to New Orleans.
That's great. We're going to open up for questions in just a minute. We have 15 minutes, so we're doing fine. But I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask each of you one question that comes to my mind that many of them perhaps would have asked themselves, and then you guys can come up to the mic. Peter, let me start with you. And the first thing that jumps out of my mind is if I follow the guidelines and get 30 minutes of moderately vigorous activity every single day, or even more vigorous activity 5 days a week or so, does that outweigh or compensate that sedentary behavior? How do you balance those two?
That's a great question, one that we get all the time. And a recent paper in the Lancet, one of these top-tiered medical journals, just kind of addressed that. And what we see is that people who are getting the physical activity guidelines, they still benefit from reducing their sitting. So you do get a benefit from doing it. However, people who are not meeting the guidelines, they get an even greater benefit from reducing their sitting. And it turns out that if you have to sit a lot, if you have an occupation where you need to sit most of the day, that the physical activity guidelines are not quite enough for you. You'll actually have to do more. And the actual physical activity guidelines, there's a range. People don't realize it's 150 minutes to 300 minutes a week. Most people focus on that 150 minutes, 30 minutes a day. But, so, I really feel that people who are sedentary need to be aiming more for that 300 minutes a day, and that will help obliterate the effects of sitting.
Okay, great. And Jason, let me ask you, we were talking a little bit before you went on about applying Donna's talk with apps to sleep. So maybe you want to comment a little bit about the use of apps to monitor your sleep.
Sure. It's interesting. I think things like Fitbit, they're certainly useful, and I would say they give you a general idea of what your sleeping behaviors might be, but sort of the caveat is that the technology as such, the way it works is that it tries to estimate sleep based on movement. So it's an accelerometer, and the idea being that if you're immobile or not moving, then you're probably sleeping, and they usually have these algorithms that say like there's a certain amount of time that must go by that you are immobile to be counted as sleep. That's usually how these devices work. They tend to be more accurate for people who have less sleep disturbance, and they tend to be less accurate for people who have more sleep disturbance. Unfortunately, it's the people who have more sleep disturbance that want to use these things, right? So in terms of the accuracy, I think that's a little bit of an issue. But I would still say there are some benefits. I mean, the nice thing is that you can collect data over long periods of time, and so you can start to see patterns. I think also in terms of behaviors that you can change, what you might see is that you're not allocating enough time for sleep, so that's where we get into like the sleep window. So I think it can have its benefits. It's what I usually see for people with insomnia is they get too caught up in looking at it, and that's when it can be a little bit detrimental too.
Good. Donna, let me have a question for you, and then we'll open up. So you started your talk about the importance of calorie balance, and that we have this electronic dashboard of apps and knowing that. So my question for you is, how important is it regarding the accuracy or lack of accuracy of calculating calories burned or inputting calories that you're consuming when we're talking calorie balance? And we know there's inaccuracies in both of it. So how much should people get caught up in that? Or is it really the process of self-monitoring that's more important?
Bob, I think the most important thing to self-monitor is weight. So for weight loss maintenance, we recommend weighing daily. And then if we see weight going up, then it's time to intervene again. To me, one of the most miraculous things about Mother Nature is that we keep our weight as stable as it is, because it is impossible to be completely accurate about determining calorie needs and calorie intake. It's a fool's errand to do that. We do want to be monitoring food intake, though, because it's not because it's such an exact science that you're taking in 1,733 calories, because you don't know that. There's a margin of error there. But what we do want people to be, what we do want to use self-monitoring of food intake for is making people aware of what they're eating, So it's that sort of mindfulness aspect of food intake that's so important. Because many times, we know the food diaries work. We know that food diaries work in producing weight loss. But I think they really work in making people aware of what they're eating and sort of promoting that mindfulness. Can I ask the sleep doctor a question? Sure. Okay. So, as you get older, you have more trouble sleeping through the night because you have to get up and go to the bathroom. So what can we do about that?
Well, so I can't prevent you from going to the bathroom directly anyways. I guess what we do sometimes tell people is just manage your liquid intake in the evening time, so part of it is preventive. To some extent, if you consolidate sleep, if you deepen sleep, you also can increase the threshold that you will wake up, making it harder to wake up. So sometimes it's not, this goes to the quality versus quantity question, where if you can improve the quality by deepening sleep a little bit, you might stand a better chance not to wake up from it. And then I always tell people, go and get an evaluation just to make sure there isn't something else going on. This is probably more so for men in case, it's something with the prostate. But it is a challenge. But I would say it's not so much how much you wake up during the night, because even normal people do wake up once or twice. That's actually fairly normal. It takes you like more than 30 minutes to fall back asleep. So it's the prolonged awakenings that are more problematic from a clinical standpoint.
Great. So let me open up to any questions. We have about 8 minutes or so till the end of the session. So please, if you could use 1, 2 microphones, that would be great. Go ahead, please.
Okay. What I've learned trying to maintain 125-pound weight loss, that surgery 5.5 years ago, after about 2.5 years, I started to do what I always do, gain. But I wanted to nip this in the bud because I'm too old for this. But the thing that has touched me the most is I don't need as much damn food as I've been eating. We need so little food to survive and be healthy. So what I really am taking away from this is dietary vigilance. And the whole notion of one meal with a replacement makes absolutely good sense, and it works best for me, and then I don't struggle as much. But thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And by the way, I do keep a journal, and I do weigh every day. That's the only way I know how to be
Great.
Halfway sane.
Thanks. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, this question is for Dr. Kaczmarzyk. I saw you speak at the Obesity Society meetings about 6-7 years ago, and you presented the early data on sitting, and it really profoundly changed the way I address my clients. I have a weight loss practice, and so it helped me look at, reducing sedentary time. Everybody only has so much time to exercise, but how you reduce sedentary time. And I asked you guys a question then, and you didn't have the data, so I'm going to ask the same question now, 6 years later. What about active sitting? Does that show anything, like sitting on exercise balls, wobble chairs, things like that? Does that show the same kind of muscular activation as standing would?
Great, good question.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I guess the short answer is no. In order to really overcome the gravity associated with sitting, you have to get up and move. John Jakizek, who Donna mentioned earlier, did a study where they had people just simply stand up or use an exercise ball and these sorts of things to sit on. And the difference in calories expended versus sitting was really negligible. So if you're thinking about weight loss or having these sorts of items available for weight loss, I'd be very skeptical that they're going to do much.
It wouldn't really count towards that movement during sedentary time.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my comment or question is going to be for Dr. Ryan. Thanks for your talk. This was actually a really interesting session. But you did say one thing that kind of sparked my interest. So you said that you would recommend weighing every day. And as a scientist and a health professional, I understand the theory behind that and the idea behind that. It's going to be top of mind. We're going to be thinking about it. It'll help keep us on track. I would put a little bit of pushback there, saying that in the real world, there's a lot of situations, and I've seen it firsthand. I've seen it with my wife. I've seen it with support groups where that creates a lot more mental health problems, a lot more stress, where people abuse or misuse that tool, and it causes more harm than good. And so when I hear someone saying that they would recommend, as a blanket statement, weighing every day, I think it's like what we heard about the diets, where not everything works for everyone. So I was just hoping I can get your comment on that a little bit.
Well, we used to tell patients, don't weigh every day.
Yep.
We used to say, oh no, there's a lot of variation in day-to-day weight, and it'll just be discouraging if you're doing your behaviors right and you see your weight go up. So particularly in the weight loss sort of period, the historic tradition has been not to weigh daily, but to have these weekly weigh-ins where it's, all or nothing.
Yeah.
So you're weighing once a week. But I think the whole idea of weight loss maintenance is to self-monitor and to monitor weight. So weighing daily is the sort of current strategy. Would you agree with that, Bob?
I agree in general, but if you are driving yourself crazy, and it produces a paradoxical effect, and all you're thinking about is your weight and your diet, then that's not a good strategy for you.
Well, and I'll give you an example. I'm part of a bariatric support group, like an online Facebook group webpage, and I get so frustrated with, and I don't want to classify the group, but it's typically the middle-aged women, and post-op, I'm sorry, I love you all, but I get a little frustrated because it is daily posts of, oh my God, I lost 0.6 of a pound, and this week I lost 3 pounds, and it's as a health professional in my research, and in my area, I would kind of throw this out to you as a medical professional, as a doctor. What does weight tell you? If you have someone's weight in your office, as that individual, does that tell you anything about their health, or how well they're doing post-op, or anything like that? So it's kind of a little devil's advocate there, sorry.
Well, I'll just summarize it. That has to be individualized, like everything we do. We have patients who weighing themselves every day really contextualizes their entire day and where their energy balance is. I have other patients where it drives me crazy, and that's where that interaction comes in. If twice a week works for you, do it twice a week. If every day doesn't, do it for you. So I think that's kind of the take home for that kind of monitoring. So thanks for your comment. Yep.
I think it's important that you catch weight regain early rather than later. So you want to catch it at 5 pounds, not 20
Correct.
pounds.
Yep.
So, but I believe there's a golden mean in there somewhere when it comes to how frequently people should weigh.
Super. Please.
I want to know, does menopause affect your sleeping? Because when I was on estrogen, I didn't have that problem. But I see these ladies shaking their head. And what can we do about that?
So the answer is yes. Okay. And I wish I could stop there, but it does get tricky. I mean, because hormonal imbalance and changes in hormone regulation can certainly impact sleep. The hot flashes, just the physical discomfort from that. There are some studies, some using cognitive behavior therapy, that are trying to reduce. So again, this goes to not necessarily preventing you from waking up, but reducing the amount of time you are awake once you wake up. So that seems to be where we can make some difference. I think there are other studies looking at other techniques like acupuncture and so forth. Some people do take medication. It is challenging. And so sometimes if you can work through that rough kind of perimenopausal period and postmenopausal, once the hot flashes stop, a lot of times sleep can get better. So, I guess I don't have a real good answer. I think people have used a combination of different techniques. But yeah, I think there is more research being done on it now. So hopefully in a few years we can have a better answer for you. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't necessarily, well, it is different from person to person, but yeah, it can.
So we have time for one more question, please.
Yes, speaking of doing the daily weigh-in, I've been, for the past 30 days, been very intentional about getting this 10,000 steps or more per day, where before I was, just whatever happened. And I've been watching the scale, I've been eating the same thing, and I've not lost a pound. Some days I'm actually going up a couple pounds. And I'm just wondering, is there anything else that I should be looking for, maybe the protein or another measurement of the improvement that I'm getting from the increased exercise?
Who wants to take that? Go ahead.
Well, I could just say that don't be discouraged about not losing weight through walking or increasing your physical activity. You're getting tremendous health benefits by making 10,000 steps a day. It may not be related to weight loss, but like I showed in the presentation, you're getting tremendous health benefits from doing that. But as Dr. Ryan mentioned too, the dietary intake side of the equation is extremely important for weight loss. If you're looking for that scale to move, it may not be just hitting 10,000 steps. You're going to have to do some of the other strategies that she discussed. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. That kind of brings this session to a conclusion. Thank you, panel. And I think we have about a 45-minute break, and then there's another breakout session after that in both of the rooms, and just pick one you'd like to go to. Thank you.